These fish live in the Pacific Ocean off the western United States. They're out there for 2 or 3 years. They move thousands of kilometers while they're out there. And then finally, the spawning adults, when the adults are ready to reproduce, they migrate upstream from the ocean to many of these small streams, and that takes several weeks or months to do. So these fish spawn in many different rivers. They come from the ocean, they come through San Francisco Bay, past the city of San Francisco and up into this estuary, and then go up into all these different streams, and up into very small streams where they actually mate and reproduce. So, for those of you who have some computer programming experience, this is a diagram of the software that we built for this model. It actually has 4 different kinds of model. There's one for the adult fish, one for the reds, which are the nests of eggs that they produce in the small streams. There's a separate model for the juveniles, and one for the fish that are out in the ocean. So when the model runs, it actually makes separate copies of each of these models for each place that the fish are. And then the fish actually move from the models for the various life stages as the model executes. So this is an extremely complex individual-based model. It's probably the most complicated ecological or individual-based model that anybody's ever built. And I'm going to try to give you a quick idea what it looks like when it runs. I think you'll be impressed by what a mess it makes. Let's see. Many windows open up on your computer. Let's see, what's this? So here, in this window, we have the adults migrating up from the ocean through this network of streams. And then when they get to these streams where the fish mate and reproduce, one of these models opens up for each stream where the fish reproduce. And then when the juvenile fish are ready to migrate back to the ocean, we can see them here going back downstream. And you can see it's a very complicated model. And after we built this software, we realized that we had learned a very important lesson that we could have learned more easily by listening to Dr. Grimm, which was, overall this model is extremely complicated, but at the same time, each part of the model, each one of these different life stages, is still too simple to solve any real-world problems. Because if we put in enough detail to solve many real problems in all the life stages, this model would be 20 times more complicated than it is already. So the lesson, well, I'll get to the lessons learned after I can figure out how to stop this thing. Okay. All right, so several lessons learned from this experience. First, if someone hands you a conceptual document and says, here's our idea for this model, and you build the model and program it, you should run away. And second, and so the lesson is that modeling needs to be part of a multidisciplinary research program, not an isolated path. It's okay. And it's very reassuring to see the way the program here is going, where the people doing the modeling and the people that are doing the empirical research and the epistemological research are either the same person or they're working together closely, and that's very good. But the most important lesson learned is if someone asks you to build a model of a complicated system, you should also run away. So the clue that this was going to be a disaster was right in the at the beginning when I said the objective is to develop a management model for these fish. This is not a clear, sharply defined problem. It's basically saying we're going to build a model of this system without saying which problem of this system we're going to solve. And that should be a strong warning that this is going to be a disaster. So instead of modeling a complicated system, we model a specific problem of a complex system. Because if you don't specify the problem as well as the system, there's no way to limit the model's complexity. You don't know what you need to include in the model, you don't know what you can leave out. And it turned out in this salmon system, there are many very good problems to model, but they require different kinds of models for the different life stages. And in fact, one of the projects I'm working on now is to build a model of how river flows and temperatures affect the number and size of juvenile salmon, which is a very tractable, solvable problem. And we're having much more success with that. Okay, well that's a good start on deciding how complex a model should be, but it turns out for individual-based models especially, just having a well-defined problem isn't usually sufficient. That many different kinds of model could address the same problem. So how do you decide what details within a model do you need to address a specific problem? And this is where we talk about pattern-oriented modeling. And this is the strategy for helping decide exactly what things we need in an individual-based model. So what do we mean by pattern-oriented modeling? One definition is it's the explicit consideration of multiple patterns that have been observed in the real system and that seem to characterize its processes and mechanisms relevant to the problem that you're addressing. So the important words in here are consideration of multiple patterns, not just one or two patterns, but several very different patterns observed in the real system. So these are things that we feel like we really know about the real system and that characterize the system's behavior relevant to the problems that we're trying to model. So the first application of pattern-oriented modeling is designing the model structure. So the questions when you're designing a model structure are, first of all, what entities, what kinds of things should be in a model? What variables do those entities need to have? You know, do you need to know their size and their sex and their life history status, or do you just need to know one or two things about them? And then what processes and behaviors should be in the model? So that the way we can answer that question is that the model should include the entities, variables, and processes needed to make it possible for these characteristic patterns we've observed in the real world to emerge from the model. And I'll give an example of this. So the first step in pattern-oriented modeling is therefore to identify a few patterns, and they should be patterns in different things. That's why I say diverse patterns. So some maybe at the individual level, some at the population level, and having to do with different characteristics of the system. So these patterns are observed in the real system at both population and individual levels, where they could be from your field studies, can also be from the literature, and that they characterize the system behavior with respect to the problem being modeled. And that means that they emerge from the same mechanisms and processes that you think are important for the problem that you're trying to model. So one way to think about these patterns is that think about things that if your model could not reproduce, then you would not be confident that the model is useful for the problem that you're trying to solve. That's one way to think about what a characteristic pattern is. The example I'm going to use is an application of pattern-oriented modeling to the design of an individual-based model of pest control by birds on a Jamaican coffee farm. I did this project with Matt Johnson, who's a professor of wildlife at our university. I understand they grow some coffee here in Brazil, is that correct? A little bit? Okay. Whether you know it or not, I'm willing to bet that you have these coffee borer beetles here. Globally, they're the most important pest on coffee plants. They're extremely small. This is one coffee berry, and this is a female beetle. They take about a day to drill a hole into these coffee berries, and then once they're in there, they lay their eggs and create a little colony of beetles inside the coffee berry and ruin the coffee berry. So Professor Johnson spends a lot of, does a lot of research in Jamaica on coffee farms, and he studies warblers that migrate from North America and spend the winter on these coffee plantations and in the surrounding forest. And he discovered that these birds sometimes eat the beetles. They can't get all their food from these beetles, but occasionally when the beetles are quite abundant, the birds will switch and start eating the beetles and therefore reduce the amount of destruction of the coffee harvest. So coffee farms, their habitat is quite diverse. So another unusual thing about this presentation, maybe you don't know so much about salmon, but I don't have to explain what coffee farms look like, which is good because I've never been on a coffee farm. But I got this picture from Matt, and Danilo tells me that this is what Brazilian coffee farms often look like. Different kinds of habitat. There's coffee grown in the sun, there's coffee grown in the shade, there's forest, and then there's little patches of trees and fragments of forest. So in our model, we represented these different kinds of habitat. There's intact forest along one side. There's little patches or fragments of forest and individual trees. The yellow is sun coffee, the gray is shade coffee, and then there's a couple other habitat types that aren't used at all by the birds. So the purpose of the model was to understand and predict the effects of changes in coffee farm habitat on the amount of these beetles that are eaten by the birds. And specifically, we wanted the model to predict how the area and arrangement of these habitat types, especially the sun coffee and the shade coffee, affect the bird populations and therefore how much the birds reduce the destruction of coffee by the beetles. So how did we design this model? First, we thought about what characteristic patterns have we observed in this system, and therefore what needs to be in the model so that these patterns could emerge. So these are patterns mostly observed by Matt Johnson in his field studies. First of all, the infestation rates by the beetles. This is the percent of coffee that has been affected by the beetles. That it increases over the coffee growing season, and it's higher on coffee bushes that are in these exclosures. So this is an experimental technique where you put a net around a coffee bush, and that keeps the birds out, but not the beetles. So it's a way to evaluate how much the birds affect the beetle population. If you keep out the birds, then you can see how many beetles you would have if there weren't birds. So this is the percent of coffee bushes that are that have been, or the percent of coffee berries that have been ruined by the beetles inside the exclosure and then outside the exclosure where the birds are eating them. Second pattern is that inside these exclosures, the beetle infestation rates are higher in the sun coffee than in the shade coffee. Third pattern is that bird densities are 2 or 3 times higher in the shade coffee than in the sun coffee. So the birds, there's more birds where there's trees mixed in with the coffee. The fourth pattern is that the reduction in beetle infestation is higher where the infestation rate is higher. So the higher the infestation rate, the more effect the birds have in reducing the infestation rate. Fifth, Matt observed a short-term population explosion in the other insects that the birds eat, and he observed that the birds very quickly moved to where the food was very abundant and started feeding there. Pattern 6 was that the bird density went up when the food availability went up in the coffee farms and went down when the food availability went down. And the eighth pattern is observed from radio tagging data, where he observed the location of the birds once every hour and then measured how far the birds were from 1 hour to the next. And he developed this distribution, which is a log normal distribution. So there are many short movements, but occasional movements of 300 or 400 meters within an hour. And the ninth pattern is that the consumption of these beetles by the birds is episodic. The beetles make only a small percent, 8% of the overall food of the birds, but for short periods the birds consume almost exclusively the coffee beetles. So what do these patterns tell us about the model's structure? First of all, so how do they tell us what needs to be in the model? First of all, many of these patterns are changes over time. So that means the model needs to be dynamic. It needs to simulate how things change over time. And many ecological models are not dynamic. They don't have time in them. But this one clearly needs to be. Second, many of the patterns are differences among the habitat types. So that tells us that we have to represent space. We have to represent the different habitat types. And because the habitat varies over quite small scales in these coffee farms, that means we need a fairly fine resolution of the space. So we ended up selecting 5 by 5 meter grid cells to represent the habitat. The patterns make it clear that bird foraging, how the birds decide where to feed and what to feed on, is the key behavior that we need to have in the model. They often show that the patterns also show that the birds move quite often, so we need a short time step. And we know this from watching birds, everybody knows this, that they move quite rapidly. So we actually started assuming a 1 minute time step for this model. So to potentially reproduce these patterns, so to make it possible that these patterns could emerge in our model, we had to include these things. Also, first of all, we had to represent the infestation rate by the coffee beetles. That's one of the variables that several of the patterns are about. And how that infestation rate varies over time and between the shade and sun coffee. But there was nothing in the patterns about the population dynamics of the beetles. So we don't have to represent their birth and death or anything, just the infestation rate. And that helped us keep the model simple. Some of the patterns were about the observations with exposures, so we had to represent exposures in the model, so we just have some simple code that represents what the infestation rate would be if there were no birds. One of the patterns concerned these population explosions of insects, so we had to code that in the model. And then one of the patterns was about changes in bird density, in other words, changes in the population of birds, and that means we have to have something in the model that allows the number of birds to change. And because we're only modeling a few months, and that doesn't include the reproductive period, the process we chose that allows the number of birds to vary is either mortality or emigration leaving the model due to starvation, because if birds don't get enough food, they die very rapidly because their metabolisms are so high. So we basically took all those lessons that we learned from the patterns and they essentially told us almost exactly what the model had to look like, and there was very little else that we needed to do to build the first version of the model. And so this is what it looks like. We have this artificial landscape with these little birds that, this is a trace of one bird's movement during one day. So they move around to the patch that has the highest food availability in their immediate surrounding and just feed there until the food is depleted, that's to the point that some other patch is more beneficial. And they switch to eating the coffee beetles when that's more beneficial than eating the other food. So it's a quite simple model, and once we had figured out what these patterns told us about what needs to be in the model, it was very easy to build. Just some results from the model after we finished building it and then calibrated it. It told us that small areas of trees and shade are adequate to support enough birds to reduce the beetle infestation by an economically important amount. We varied the size and number of tree patches, and it had very little effect, so it didn't matter if there were lots of small tree patches or a few big ones. When there's very little insect productive habitat, it can actually be profitable to convert some of the coffee from sun coffee to shade coffee, just because that produces more birds and they reduce the infestation rate. But in contrast, if you have too much tree or forest habitat, the birds spend all their time there and never go eat the beetles on the coffee. So you can actually have too much good habitat for the birds to control the beetles. All right, so now let's move on to the second question, is how do we model the adaptive behavior of the individuals? And this is really the key issue in individual-based modeling. This is what's new and fun about individual-based modeling, is deciding what traits or rules for behavior are useful in a particular system and for a particular problem. And this is what I like to refer to as theory in individual-based modeling. A theory is a model of what the individuals do that explains the dynamics of the system. So we're not trying to do what behavioral ecologists do and understand all the details of what an individual does. We're trying to understand just enough about the individual behavior so that when we put it in an individual-based model, we can reproduce what happens to the population. So we have to remember that we're doing population modeling that depends on individual behavior. And these theories in individual-based modeling can be tested against observations in the real system, and they can be general and reusable building blocks that we can use in multiple models. This idea of theory is actually from the literature on complex systems, and so in books like this one, they talk about this kind of theory as having the goal of capturing just enough essence of the individual behavior to model the system. And again, this is how we can integrate across ecological levels between the individual and population levels. So how do we do this? This is a second step in pattern-oriented modeling. We can hypothesize alternative models for individual behavior, and then test those models by whether or not, when we put them in the individual-based model, they cause it to reproduce the patterns we've observed in the real system. So we describe this pattern-oriented theory development cycle. We start with our field research in the literature, and we do two things. We identify these characteristic patterns that we've already talked about, and then we also, from the literature, we can propose theories or alternative traits or rules for how the individuals make their decisions. And we put those in the individual-based model, and then we run the model and see how well it reproduces these observed patterns. And then we can go back. Often we find out that some of the rules can cause the model to reproduce some of the patterns, and we might need to go back and look for additional patterns that help us better separate different behavior traits, or we might actually have to go back in the field and design some new experiments to help us separate the traits that work better from those that don't work as well. So the example I want to talk about is back to fish. The model I've spent most of my career working with in individual-based modeling was motivated by managing rivers, especially how do we manage these large storage reservoirs where we have a big dam and we can control the flow and to some extent the temperature of the water, and how do we do that to, or how do changes in the river habitat affect the population of trout, which are the cold water fish species in North America. So we built a model called InStream that we have used in many different applications for research and for actual management decisions. And in this model, we modeled the stream habitat as a collection of cells, and then the individual fish choose which cell they're going to occupy to feed in, and the amount of growth they get depends on the characteristics of the cells, and it also affects their mortality risk. So whether or not they grow and reproduce and whether or not they die, most often of predation, depends on how they choose which cell to occupy. So this is a question that ecologists refer to as habitat selection, and it's a trade-off between mortality risk and energy intake. So for a fish, if it's just trying to find the best place to feed, well, a location like this might be best because there's high velocities that bring the food. These fish just sit and wait for the water to bring food to them. So a place where there's good visibility, they can see the food, there's high velocities bringing lots of food by, would be a good place to catch all the food that you can. But it's also a very dangerous place because these birds are often eaten, or these fish are often eaten by birds that feed from above, so anytime they're visible, it's very risky. So the safest place might be over here in the dark, but you can't see food as well over there. And if you're a very small fish, you're most likely to be eaten by a big fish. So you might want to go in this habitat that's very shallow because the big fish won't go there. So to model these adaptive behaviors, we need to be able to model trade-offs like this between food and predation risk. And they depend on the individual state, so a small fish makes a different decision from a big fish. They depend on the behavior of the other individuals because you can't occupy some habitat that a bigger fish has already occupied. And these models must be able to respond to unforeseen changes. For example, this nice quiet stream one day can look like this the next day. If there's a big rain, the habitat changes quite dramatically in a very short time. So how do we model decisions like this? There's a literature called dynamic state variable modeling. I don't know if people are familiar with this. It's very popular with behavioral ecologists. It's basically about how to model trade-offs between growth and risk. And it's based on the assumption that animals make decisions to maximize some direct estimate of their future fitness over a specific time horizon. For example, they may make decisions to maximize their expected probability of surviving for the next 30 days, or something like maximizing their expected probability of surviving and getting big enough to reproduce by the time the next reproductive season comes around. So this expected probability of survival over a future time depends not only on predation, we all understand how predation can affect survival, but also on food intake, because if you don't eat enough food, you'll starve to death over this future period, and you also won't grow big enough to reproduce. So putting food intake and predation risk in this common currency of expected survival over a future time period is how we model the trade-off. And these decisions are state dependent, that a hungry animal, for example, will make different decisions than a happy one, because a hungry animal is more likely to starve to death, so it's going to take chances, take more predation risk in order to avoid starving to death. So, I'm going to skip that. So this kind of modeling smells right. It seems like what we want to do, but in the classical approaches to it, it's treated as an optimization problem that can only be solved if we know what all the future conditions are. But we don't know that in an individual-based model because the future conditions depend on how all the other individuals behave. So we started with this, and our solution was to let the animals use a simple prediction of habitat conditions in the future. Basically, we said, just assume that for the next 90 days, things are going to be the same as they are today, and make the best decision you can today, and then start all over tomorrow when things change. So they make a prediction. It's a kind of an extremely simple prediction, but they update it every day. I'm going to move on to, okay, so that's a description of how this theory that we developed works. So now the question is it successful in modeling how real trout behave? And so we went back to this theory development cycle and went to the literature and identified 6 patterns that people have observed in real fish. First is that when there's a high flow, suddenly there's a lot of rain and the river comes up. These fish just move to the side of the stream where the velocities are slower. We compared 3 alternative rules for individual behavior. The first one is the most widely used assumption in behavioral ecology, which is just that animals are always trying to maximize their growth rate. The second one is that the animals are trying to maximize their survival probability. And then the third one is the rule that we developed where they're trying to maximize their expected survival over this future time period that combines both food and predation. So we can see this response to high flow is reproduced by all 3 of the alternative theories. A couple other patterns were reproduced both by the maximizing growth and by our theory. A pattern that says that individuals move when you add a bigger predator to the system was reproduced by the survival theory and also by ours. But the important patterns are these last 2. First, that fish occupy higher velocities at higher temperatures. That's because when temperature goes up, their metabolism goes up, so they need more food just to stay alive, and you can get more food by using higher velocities. And the second one is that if you suddenly reduce the amount of food available to a fish, they will very quickly move and try to find better habitat. And those 2 patterns were not reproduced by either of these simpler theories, and that's because they require this assumption that fish are thinking about the future, that you're considering how your food interacts with your metabolism over a future time period to affect your survival probability. So this is a very clear example of using these patterns from the real world and the individual-based model to compare alternative rules for individual behavior and identify some that seem to work well. Okay, so that was really easy. So let's try some really complex behavior. It turns out that real trout not only decide where to feed, they also decide when to feed and when to hide from predators. And there's been a lot of recent literature showing that fish adaptively switch between feeding during the day and feeding during the night. So can we put this second adaptive behavior in our model? So we tried this. So that now the fish are making a decision among 4 alternatives. They can feed during the day and hide at night. They can feed both in the day and at night. They can hide during the day and feed at night, or they can hide all the time. Okay? And to make this really interesting, now we have to add to the model that growth and mortality risk, instead of just varying among the habitat cells and the characteristics of the fish, now they also vary between day and night, because at night you can't see food as well, so your growth rate is less, but the predators can't see you, so you're safer. And growth and mortality depend on your activities. So if you're hiding, you're not getting any food, so you're slowly losing weight, but you don't have any predation risk. So to model this, we assume each fish looks at all four of these combinations of activity and each of the habitat cells that they might move to, and selects the combination that provides the highest expected survival over a future time horizon. And there's quite a literature on this. There's a number of patterns that have been observed in the laboratory and in real streams. This is a study site that we used. It's on the river below that large dam that I showed a picture of. So we tried to see if we could reproduce these patterns that have been observed. So one of them was that there's more feeding at night when the temperature is low. So when the temperature is low, the fish's metabolism is low, so it doesn't need as much food. And in our model, as well as in the experimental data, as the temperature goes down, the percent of fish that feed at night goes up like this. So we very closely reproduce this pattern from the observations. A second one was that there's more daytime feeding when food is scarce. So if we reduce the food supply, the percent of fish that are feeding during the day goes up just like this. And that's because you reduce the food supply, the fish need to feed more efficiently, which you can during the day, so they take more risk to feed during the day. Some other patterns that the model reproduced was that feeding fish use shallower habitat at night, they feed closer together at night, and if you have competition from larger fish, you can change the time at which fish feed. So that was very exciting, that we could reproduce these patterns in how fish choose their activity, and that led to the next set of experiments, which there's this very fashionable field in ecology now called trait-mediated trophic interactions. Trophic interactions have to do with how the population of predators affects the population of their prey, and then how the population of their prey affects the amount of resource or food that these prey eat. So this is one of the oldest concepts of ecology, is that it's the population of predators increases, then they eat more prey, and so the population of prey goes down, and so the population of their resource goes up because there's fewer prey eating them. But recently there's been a lot of attention to how behavior is part of this whole system, that when there's more predators, they not only eat more of the prey, but the prey aren't so stupid, they know there's more predators, and so they behave to avoid the predators, and they might do things like eating less, spending less time feeding, and so their population can actually go down because of the behavior they use to avoid the predators, not just because they've been eating. So when I first started reading about this, I thought, well, our model can reproduce this. So these trait-mediated indirect interactions, they're really important because they illustrate the strong effects of these trade-off behaviors on all levels of ecology, and they're also a very fashionable topic. Lots of papers. So we wanted to show that we could reproduce this with our individual-based model. All the models of this phenomenon have been population or community level models based on differential equations. So we identified some characteristic interaction patterns from the literature, things that people have observed in the literature, and we showed that